Hello, hello, and welcome to another Lunch and Learn webinar from the Northern BC Community of Practice. The CoP, for those who are new, is a group of organizations and individuals whose purpose is to build restoration practitioner efficacy and capacity through improved knowledge sharing, communication, and collaboration. We are guided by an organizing team with core members from CERN BC, Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, BC Wildlife Federation, and the Caribou Habitat Restoration Fund via HCTF. This webinar is being recorded in its entirety, including the Q&A, and you'll be able to watch it later on CERN BC's YouTube channel. So today we're joined by Aaron Mackay, who's the General Manager for Fixed Earth. He's going to share some knowledge around the do's and the don'ts they found in project planning and execution on disturbed sites, including native seed planting. Take it away, Aaron.
Thanks, May. So to start off, I would like to begin by acknowledging that this presentation is being shared from and will discuss reclamation and restoration efforts and lessons that have taken place in Treaty 8 territory, the ancestral lands and home of the Cree, Dene, and Dene-Zaa, or Beaver peoples, as well as the Métis Nation. Specifically, the learnings that we'll share today have happened on the traditional territories of the Saulteaux, West Moberly, Halfway, Blueberry River, Prophet, Fort Nelson, and Doig River nations. I've been very lucky to work with inspiring and passionate people from these nations that shaped me, the work I do, as well as the guidances and ever-evolving cooperative frameworks that inform this work. I honor the history, languages, and cultures of the nations whose presence continues to enrich this vibrant region. I would also like to thank some partners who've worked with us in a lot of this work, the Orphan Site Reclamation Fund of BC, as well as Plantair Services, who we've worked with to execute a lot of the work that we'll be talking about over the last couple of years. So with that, a little bit about myself. So as May said, my name is Aaron Mackay. I'm an agrologist who has worked out of the Fort St. John region in Northeast BC for over a decade. I spent a lot of that time in environmental consulting, but have recently moved over and am working now for Fixed Earth Innovations, which is a biotechnology company that's also based out of Fort St. John in Northeast BC. And we do a lot of work to help folks with in situ remediation, as well as seed procurement, native seed procurement, seeding, and some of our amendments and technologies that we will allude to through this talk that come to help with native seeding operations for restoration and reclamation. My schooling was primarily in soil and plant science, which I mentioned just so that everyone is aware of the biases that come in with that as I'm talking about how important the soil is all the time. And yeah, for those who aren't familiar with the Fort St. John area, it's a agricultural and forested area in Northeast BC, west of the mountains. And as such, it's primarily a boreal forest, mixed wood. Some areas are conifer dominated, some areas deciduous dominated, but a lot of mixed wood in through there. We have a lot of similar ecosystems as Northwest Alberta, going all the way right up to the border, from more plains type ecosystems to the south, up into more subarctic ecosystems to the north as we get into the Fort Nelson areas and beyond. All right, so with all of that being said, let's jump into some of the things that we have to talk about today. And we'll start off with the project planning area. So when planning projects, it's contrite, it's said all the time, but the first point I want to make is considering your site. All types of industrial and other disturbance that you might be looking to restore on the well site are all slightly different. In the picture on the right here, we can see a well site, an access road, and then the widening of that access road to connect onto the main roadway there. And even just on a site like this, there are some differences in what you can see on here for the well site versus the road and other things. A lot of the work that we do in the Northeast is based around oil and gas restoration. And just generally, there'll be a lot of different considerations that you make if you are restoring, say, a road versus a well site versus some sort of exploratory track, your access to the surrounding environment, the native plants that might already be coming back in that area are going to be very different. When seeding, the recommendation from me is always to plant for an early seral version of the targeted end land use. So if it's a forested land use, like is in the picture, it's not usually very effective to plant the species that you'll find in the surrounding forest underneath those trees. And that just comes down to the condition of the site as it is. The crown closure and openness are going to be very different than the surrounding area. All of the plants that are under those currently treed areas, they are going to expect to be growing in a much wetter, more shaded environment than you're going to find in the middle of that well site. So even if you plant in there, it is best to have, I'm sorry if anyone can hear my children in the next room. That will hopefully get resolved right away. Anyways, you want to plant for an early seral version of the landscape you're doing. If you're oftentimes for a site like this, we would plant a lot of species that we expect to find, say, post-fire in these environments where the situation is going to be much more open instead of a lot of the under tree species vegetation. It's really easy to say. It's a lot harder to carry through all of your site planning and preparation and carry through that with other stakeholders to get through to the end. Other things to really always keep in mind that we'll go over a little bit more as we go through here. Are there erosion concerns on the site? Are there existing agronomics or invasive weeds that you're trying to get rid of on that site? And are there any other available native seed sources nearby that you can pull from? Some of the folks that I've been working with a lot in this area recently who operate industrial sites, there's been a growing push to, wherever possible, try to keep areas on that site where native species can grow. So whether that be a soil pile or a soil berm, an area of the site that's no longer needed for operations, if you can turn some of those areas back and get native species growing there rather than agronomics, the ability to pull that seed bank and that soil through later on for full reclamation of that site can really help to allow you to avoid having to do a lot of seeding or other interventions in order to get those native species growing again. The other thing that really comes up that we have to consider for a lot of these sites is, do we even have something that we would consider topsoil for post-reclamation? Depending on the age of the site and a lot of factors, often you don't. And it's just, my real key that comes not only as someone who works for a company that sells microbial products, but also just as a soils guy, is you really want to consider and do something to promote a healthy soil microbiome as part of your soil prep whenever possible. That can take a lot of forms. It can be, bringing in some manure onto the site and putting that in there, although that can come with its own problems regarding weeds and other things, as I'm sure lots of folks can attest to on the call. It can even just be, mixing in some of your coarse woody debris to give options for native microbes to come off of that and get into the soil again. Taking soil that, was in the top of the piles, spreading that across. It's hard sometimes where we have lots of stockpiled topsoil, where we think we have lots of really great soil, but we also have to remember that, if that soil has been piled up for 20 years in a big pile, a lot of the soil at the middle of that would have had a lot of natural microbes in it to begin with aren't there anymore. And when I say microbiome and microbes specifically, we've seen a lot of work, and I've seen a lot of effect in my work of just the effect that the microbes can have when it comes to seeding and getting plants growing in the environment. So fixed earth, we've done a couple trials where looking at like seeds grown in fairly sterile conditions versus with some of our microbes and other naturally occurring microbes. And just in every experiment that we've done, we see better germination, we see stronger growth, better root development, all of these things that you want in order to have your plants germinating and establishing, coming from having microbes present in that material. So whether it's been wildfire impacts, just the effects of having that soil stockpiled, other things, whatever you can do to increase microbial activity on your site as you're restoring it and seeding it, planting it, anything that you might be doing, I feel that there's some really strong benefits in doing that. Now, when it comes to seed mixes, this is often one of the first hangups people get into when they're planning work with native seeds. Really important, think in grams, not kilograms. And this is one of the hardest things for folks to adjust their mind to in a lot of ways, coming from planting products where you're seeding with agronomic seed species. You're not going to be getting, a 25 kilogram bag of seed and spreading that over a site. The picture on the right here, this is 6 different native plants, and at about 135, 140 grams total. And that is all of the seed that was procured for a rather large project that we'll talk about on the next slide here. Other important part when talking about seed mixes is lead times in order to get seed. You really want to give yourself a minimum of a month to try to get all the seed together, especially if this is an early or a first native seed project for you, and you don't, have some established relationships with vendors, or you don't know exactly where you're going to for your seed. You're going to want to give yourself a good amount of time. And I know we're all very used to, being able to phone up a seed supplier and have seed on site within the next couple days or a week at the most. But if you're planning for native seed, I'd really encourage you to consider kind of like 1 month to be your minimum practical lead time, especially early on in your journey into using it. The other thing that I love with native seed mixes is that it's a really good idea to include diverse species, even if you're only getting really small amounts of seed, and that seed might only be present in the seed mix at trace quantities. So we'll talk about this a little bit more going forward as well, but don't be afraid if you're designing or procuring a seed mix for a site and you can only get a couple grams of a certain plant species that you wanted to be involved in it. I would always encourage you, get that plant species, throw it in the seed mix. Even if it's, not, if there's not much seed present in the mix, you will be surprised sometimes at how often those seeds that were, less than 1% of the amount of seed total in the mix still show up on those sites, and sometimes show up really well on areas of the site you wouldn't expect. My final point here is a little bit on rethinking engagement. So oftentimes when it comes to reclamation these days, there are a lot of stakeholders that, they might be government, they might be other First Nations, municipalities. There's lots of people that can be consulted to give engagement on a reclamation plan and that these days. And I'd really encourage you, if at all possible, and it all isn't always the way it goes, but if you don't have a really specific time frame for when that seed will actually be procured and put down, if you're early in the thinking process, really try to focus a lot more on the categories of what classes of vegetation do we want included in this seed mix, and what ecosystem functions are we looking to provide through the seed mix, more than specific species. So, if someone involved doesn't want grasses involved in a species at all, that's a lot more useful than saying we're going to have a mix with these 10 forbs. Making sure that you're planning for, saying we'll do 1 or 2 grass species, 4 to 6 forb species. We'll try to get a couple of shrub species in there, and maybe a tree species. Speaking in generalities like that can be a lot more effective when it comes time to actually procure the seed and finalize things than if you really get your heart set on specific species. Sometimes that's the way it's going to be, but yeah, any work that you can put in in that way before is really valuable. The same way when I talk about ecosystem function, if getting berry producing species or certain species that are more palatable to certain types of wildlife, if that is an end goal of the reclamation, just speaking broadly about those goals and what species could fulfill them is a lot better than trying to lock down and saying, well, we want this one particular species to do this goal, but instead leaving yourself open to a class of species that can achieve a goal. And the other thing to really consider when it comes to seed mixes is seed size, which anyone who's worked with native seed, I'm sure will be well familiar with how variable that could be. So as a slight example of that, here is an example seed mix that could be used on a project. So a mix like this, it's about 6 species. So it gets away from, it doesn't have as much of the, like get high diversity even at low amounts as I was talking about in the last slide. But as we'll, go through and we're talking a little bit further on here, this is a fairly realistic seed mix of what could be available at like this given day and time or over the last month on the native seed market to actually procure and put down. Something like this. So you'll see we have the seeds listed on the left. The next column over is the amount of seeds per gram, which can be highly variable. Species like blue joint, which is a grass, and fireweed, which is a forb, are 2 very common native species that get used in reclamation here in Northeast BC. And with both of them, 15,000 seeds per gram, 28,000 seeds per gram on average, they're quite small seeds versus something like a raspberry, which is fairly common of your more berry producing species, you only get 500 seeds per gram. So, and with that, if you go all the way over to the right, we have composition by weight, which is the most common way that seed mixes are expressed for agronomic seeds. So just with the example here of the raspberry, you could be saying, well, we're putting down almost 13% of this mix is going to be raspberry. But when you look at the actual seeds and the composition by seeds column to the left, you see less than 1% of the amount of seed that's going down in that seed mix is actually raspberry, because while it's a very large, heavy seed, you then don't have very many seeds in that mixture, only, slightly under 9,000. So with something like this mixture, up at the top, you can see we're putting down just over 1.5 million seeds. The predominant species in this seed mixture is blue joint, which is a grass. But we're also using about 140 grams of seed on a proposed 6.5 hectare site, which works out to 23 seeds per meter squared, which anyone who's used to planning for and actually executing seeding with agronomic seed, I'm sure your eyes are slightly bulging at those numbers because it is far, far lower than a traditional seeding rate with agronomic seeds. And so the real lesson that I would recommend for using native seeds is that you need to find ways to make small amounts of seed go really far and make that seed as productive as it can be on your site. And we'll talk about some of the ways that we've been doing this as we go through, but yeah, that difference in planning for pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare of seed, you just can't make seeding recommendations like that when it comes to utilizing native seed. And we've had some very good success on utilizing native seed at, rates that get down to on a per meter basis as low as like 5 seeds per square meter and stuff like that. And you adjust that as different concerns come in and out. You might, utilize cover crops, as we'll talk about a little bit more. This particular mix, with it being, predominantly blue joint, was planned for a site that has a lot of very serious erosion concerns as well too. And so that is a reason why there was more comfortability in the folks who we were working on this project with in order to use a lot of grasses, just to ensure that we could get that all that soil stable again after earthworks were completed. All right, so let's jump in and talk a little bit about seed procurement. And the first question that I oftentimes get asked when it comes to procuring native seed, where do I actually buy it? How do I actually get my hands on it? So for anyone who wants to take a quick screenshot or a screen grab, this is a list I've put together of a lot of different seed folks that I've worked with through Northeast BC, as well as some other places through Alberta and the Lower Mainland and the rest of BC. And there's a couple of demarcations that we have here when it comes to the types of providers. And this is fairly common, I would say, through the seed growing industry. So on the left, we have a lot of folks that do a lot of hand collection of native seed and might, do some growing out of that seed as well. But predominantly, a lot of the seed that they're getting and marketing is coming off the landscape. These are often your best resources to get a lot of really local seed or a lot of seed where you can get a lot of guarantees about where that seed came from in the landscape, the ecoregion, to try to make sure that it's really well suited for your site. Another class of vendors that we have under the native grass suppliers are a couple examples of folks who either grow or just market native seed that's predominantly grass native seed, that's grown in a more agricultural setting within fields, harvested mechanically, and they can oftentimes, market and sell kilograms of seed at a time, but it's only gonna be grass seed predominantly. You're very rarely gonna see a forb from a vendor like that, and they're not really going to be able to offer you much diversity other than that. And then finally, seed wholesalers, marketers, aggregators. There's a lot of different words that are used. So here's two examples here of one based out of BC and one based out of Alberta, where they will oftentimes go out to a lot of the smaller collectors and growers. They'll have direct relationships with them, and they will contract out to buy all or most of the seed that they produce on a yearly basis. And then they will market that to a wider audience. So you can, go to them and get perhaps a bunch of different seed species that you're looking for in a larger quantity if they have it available, which you can oftentimes get from the local growers too, but they'll just usually have a larger inventory of that seed. Other things to keep in mind with the wholesalers is oftentimes they will not be able to tell you where the seed that you would be buying comes from, either landscape wise or region wise, even sometimes specifically. Occasionally you might find one that's willing to work with you to say like what grower they bought a seed lot off of, but usually they're not willing to give you that information. So it kind of runs the gambit from the highly localized collectors who can get you, usually a wider variety of seed species depending on what they're collecting and targeting. That's really local to the larger operations that try to be a little bit more of a one-stop shop for everyone. So actual seed procurement, as we said, plan for longer lead times. Even in the best case scenario, when you have established relationships, you know what vendors you're going to. It's often going to take you multiple weeks to source and get the seed in from multiple vendors. If you're getting seed from people in different regions to wherever your office is, there can be a week plus shipping time involved in getting seed in from, somewhere in Alberta, sometimes to Fort St. John or otherwise. And then really consider when you're looking for your seed vendors, kind of a local, regional and similar ecosystem framework. So just as we were talking about in the last slide, that, there's some local collectors and growers you can buy from, there's larger wholesalers. It oftentimes comes into this same sort of framework of, if you need your seed to be really local for some reason, then you'll oftentimes keep yourself really limited to those collectors that you can find. If you can take a more regional approach, so for the Fort St. John Northeast category, if you're looking outside of just Northeast BC and you can extend your search into some vendors like ALCLA Seeds that are in kind of more central western Alberta, then you can get seed that's still species that are still applicable on a regional framework, but just not as local to you. And then on the similar ecosystem, this is where we oftentimes find ourselves going to the large scale wholesalers, and then even extending sometimes into folks like, say, seed providers out of like Montana and stuff like that, where the ecosystem is going to be similar, but the climate is different. But still plants that experience winter are going to be very similar. But oftentimes, if there's a really specific species you're looking for, depending on the time of year, you might have to find yourself going fairly far afield in order to source that species. And then the final note on seed procurement, a lot of this is all well and good trying to buy seed for a project that's, say, for 5 hectares, 10 hectares, pushing it is doable. From my own experience and talking to a lot of other folks in the native seed restoration space in Canada and the US, if you have a really large area-based project, if you're looking to reseed over 20 hectares, doing a very large program, it really behooves you to start planning a couple years out in advance and trying to make contracts with some of the local seed suppliers who can go out and collect the seed that you're interested in, and potentially contract with some of the large scale growers to try to grow out some of that seed to get you the volume that you might be looking for. It's really hard to go to the a la carte market and get enough seed to seed 100 hectares of land all at one go. And if you're going to be doing a project like that and you're looking to just buy from the general market, you need to get really thoughtful about when and where you're getting your seed from in order to make that successful. Because native seed is often very different in how it's available based on the season. Lots of folks, as you expect, and as kind of the orange boxes on this slide demonstrate, most seed collectors will be going out harvesting their seed in the fall, just as you would expect when those seeds are getting mature. But then lots of proponents think that, all right, so there's folks out collecting seed right now. That means that seed is available on the market. When in reality, there's a lot of processing, oftentimes germination testing, all of that goes into preparing that seed to make sure that it's viable to actually be marketed to you. That means that a lot of that seed doesn't actually come onto the market until much later in the winter, or oftentimes around now in the early spring, end of winter, that seed starts coming back into the market. So on the blue boxes at the bottom there, we kind of go through the seasonal trend of you get the most native seed available on the market kind of in that late April in through the start of summer. Then as that stock gets bought up, you get decreasing amounts and variety of seed that's available through the fall and into the early winter. And then depending on the year and what all is happening in the reclamation market and how much people are looking for native seed, those stocks can really start to get depleted by November, December, January, February. You can really be having to contact a lot of people and really, really scrape the bottom of the barrel to be able to find seed that's available to be sold. So oftentimes I find in the industry that folks are most interested in seed, as kind of the top graph of market demand shows here. As we get into the fall, early winter, you're wrapping up a lot of your earthworks for stuff that you've been doing through the dry portion of the summer. You want to get some seed down before snow comes or early in the winter so that it's there for the spring. And then that stock of seed starts to really, really rapidly go away. So if you're looking for seed and you're looking for seed in big quantities, the earlier in the year you can start looking for that and lock in and secure that seed, the better. That can come with its own problems around seed storage that get fun sometimes. But if you talk to your supplier, they'll usually be able to offer you some good advice on if what seed should be frozen versus put in a fridge or something like that and kept at low temperature to keep it viable and good for the time being. All right. So and then the fun part, we've got some seed, we've made our plan, we're going to go out and do some actual productive seeding on the landscape. So timing of seeding. In my experience and the experience of our company, we've really found over the last 5 years that winter seeding has been far more successful for us than spring or summer seeding. And as a caveat to that, we've had the best results on a lot of our projects seem to be when the seed is going onto snow, and rather than onto dirt that's then being snowed over in the winter. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Moisture availability, especially in that early spring window. It's really hard to get onto the land in early spring in order to actually do the seeding while the roads are terrible. It's hard to get into sites. But that really early period of spring where moisture is most available in the soil can be really, really valuable for these new seedlings that are germinating. And especially the last 5 years that have been very droughty through Northeast BC could be playing into this even more. But, I've been involved with seeding programs where we've worked really hard to try to make sure that we're seeding, right before or in line with some expected rainfall. You put the seed down, it gets rained on, and then it might be another month until rain comes again. So that moisture availability of early spring and having it down before so that you don't miss that spring window seems to be really important. As well, the cold stratification of seed, getting that down in the winter seems to do good things for germination. And just having the seed down in the winter and there in the spring, it seems to allow the seed to respond to its natural dormancy breaking processes in order to germinate and come through. So if we have time, we'll discuss a case study, but just by and large, we've seen a lot of good results and noticeably different results from sites that have been seeded over the winter compared to sites that have been seeded in the spring and summer and fall. And especially, this is an example of a site where it was seeded in early June, and we were able to get into this site because a good access road was nearby. And although the site was really, really wet, we were able to seed it without having to go onto the site. And so this one, it might have been moisture, it might have been other things, but the vegetation seemed to establish somewhat well. So it's not to say that you have to seed in the winter and it won't work anytime else. It definitely can. This site seemed to go really well, and we got some really good native seed or native plant development in through the start of this access road here that are pictured. But if you have the operational capacity and the time to pre-plan, winter really seems to do a little bit better for sure. All right. So the big problem when it comes to putting native seed down is the seed is very variable in size and oftentimes very small. How do we deal with this? So the photo in the top left, this is showing the sizes of a few different types of native seed that could be used on projects. And my biggest recommendation when working with this and planning on how to get it out onto sites is to take your native seed mix that might involve all of these different size seeds like it is there. And at the very least, mix it with something if you're planning to hand broadcast it. So the example just to the right there is a winter wheat that is a more, generic agronomically sized seed. And that is something that could be used as a cover crop in some scenarios. So what we have done in the past with with some projects and some clients that have wanted to hand broadcast seed is you take your, what might be, say, 100 grams of native seed. You look at how much cover crop that you have, and if your plan is to hand broadcast that, you end up saying, all right, we're going to have 12 loads of these hand seeders that are going to go out across our site. I would then take my native seed and, mix it all up, and I would split that native, well, what I'd probably do is take each species of that native seed and split it up into 12 small packages, and then put those small 12 packages together to make 12 versions of your seed mix rather than one big version of your seed mix. And then as our technicians or our laborers were filling up their hand seeders and going out to spread the seed, I'd fill it up with my cover crop, take one of my packages of the native seed, put that in, mix it up as best you can, and then go out and spread that hand broadcasted native seed. Because the seed is so variable in size, if you put it in a mixture just by itself or with something else, it will self-stratify itself really quickly. Just from walking around, it'll start to fall out of mixture, especially as you get into some of the really small seeds. They tend to fall through the other seed and end up at the bottom. And if you're, doing a hand distribution, you'll oftentimes find that all of those species, seem to be found as you started your transact with the hand seeder, and as you get to the end, you see a lot less of those. If you don't want to do a cover crop, there are people who have used inert material like vermiculite, and basically just put that in as a combination with their seed, just to bulk out that seed to make it useful. It's really hard to take a bag of 100 grams of seed and take that yourself or hand it to anyone and say, distribute this across a 2-hectare site by hand. Every time I've seen someone try it, it just does not work out with any sort of consistency on the seeding across that site. The other option that we use at Fixed Earth quite a bit, that we've pioneered a bit, is this encapsulation, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But there are a couple other options that seem to be on the market these days too. There's a couple companies out of Alberta that for a little while they were trying to experiment with using kind of clay as a seed coating in order to increase the size of the small native seeds to make everything more consistent. As far as I'm aware, they're no longer doing that just because folks were running into problems with germination issues of the seed actually getting through that coating. But then as well too, I've recently become aware of a company over in Alberta that they developed a biodegradable coating that they applied to the native seeds to try to increase their size and make them easier to work with in hydro seeding or hand seeding settings as well too. But what we've been using a lot of in our work is these seed capsules. So they're a biodegradable gel capsule about the size of a large daily vitamin. Some are in the picture over there for scale, and we include a lot of our microbial products that act as a native fertilizer that you see listed out there, as well as some other things. And this has been our go-to method of getting native seed in small quantities out onto sites in a consistent way. It's been really great because from a seed applicator perspective, it makes it into a very uniform package, and we can mix up the seed along with all of our other additives in the lab, get multiple seed species in there, and then package those into the capsules so that each capsule has an amount of seed from that seed mix in there along with everything else, and it's just led to a much more even distribution of the seed across the site. The other benefit, as it's alluded to on here, is that since it's so consistent and because they make such a nice larger package, we've had good luck with using them for UAV and other distribution methods like that as well. And when we're seeding these, we're typically applying them at a rate of about 2,500 to 3,000 capsules per hectare. So it does work out to be a little bit different than some of the traditional, hand broadcast seeding. You end up with the seed falling in more concentrated areas. And this is also potentially part of the reason why seeding onto snow has been working so well for us. Just being that then, as spring happens and these capsules melt on the snow, the water can carry the seed a little bit further than just the area where they land, and it spreads that seed out a little bit more as well too. But the ability for drone deployment, as someone who was practicing reclamation for a number of years, has been a little bit of a game changer as well here too, for sites that are heavily surface prepped and mounded. It really relieves a lot of the potential issues of having people walking all over that area and potentially twisting ankles. It's been a lot faster in every area that we found. And if you have multiple sites or a really large site all in close proximity to each other, the scale of savings, like you can get up. I've seen like 6 sites get seeded in one day with something like this, which might have been, a 4-day process with, two people going out to hand seed that instead. So just from a safety and a cost perspective, it's been really great. And then as well, the drone just allows for being able to put the drone up and have it calibrated to distribute the seed. We've seen such a better consistency spread of the capsules with the seed over the site than you even get with hand seeding as well too. So it's all played to do some really, really good work in consistently getting native seed out across a site when you're working with such small quantities. And the question that always comes up when we're talking about native seeding as well too is, when do we actually start monitoring it? And in an ideal world, in my mind, 2 growing seasons at least is what you want to wait before you really start looking at the efficacy of whatever seeding you had done. Lots of native seed might not germinate in the first year after it's been applied. Oftentimes it will, but it's not always a guarantee. So really giving it 2 growing seasons whenever possible is ideal before looking at how effective it's been. It doesn't mean that you can't look at that site, the same growing season after the seed was applied and say, potentially I might want to do some more interventions on this site to increase the amount of vegetation that's on it or the speed at which it's being revegetated. But don't, if you seed again and then go back 2 years after your first seeding and you say, oh wow, that second seeding was so much more successful than the first one, that can still oftentimes be your first seeding continuing to come through and improve. And so, I've seen a lot of confirmation bias that way, where people think that their later attempts at seeding were a lot more successful than their early ones. Other point I'll make really quickly on this slide that isn't actually on the slide, but seeding is not oftentimes a replacement for planting shrubs or doing tree planting. While those species can be seeded directly onto sites, even with all of the innovative technology I have ever tried to put out on a site to get things growing better, faster, and stronger, it is still years and years and years until you will see a lot of those shrubs actually, or trees, take and start to grow. Sometimes you get lucky with the alders and stuff like that. Those can establish fairly quickly in like the 3-4 year range, but it's not a replacement for tree planting. And really, tree planting is the best way to get that tree canopy growing again on the site. The other thing I'll mention in here that didn't get on its own slide, and I forgot to mention earlier, just comes down to dealing with agronomics on site. There are, some ways you can try to control agronomics on site with planting some specific species like paintbrush, which can kind of form a parasitic relationship with some grass species and try to control it that way a bit. But in my mind, really the best way of controlling invasives and agronomics on site is you need to get that tree canopy reestablished. And once you get that tree canopy reestablished, the native vegetation that is best suited and adapted for growing in wet and shady environments has a chance to compete with those agronomics that were designed and bred for growing in open fields with lots of sunlight. And yeah, I have not found a magic bullet yet to deal with that otherwise. If anyone has one they want to bring up later on in the Q&A, happy to hear it. But the other note really comes down to if you're using herbicide sprays to control your agronomics on a site, that, in my experience, that will have really drastic impacts on your ability to plant native species. The natives really get affected disproportionately by herbicides, it seems, and even years later, it can seem to have a lasting effect of growth on a site. All right. So in summary, we went through planning and procurement. The more time you can give yourself for planning, the better. If you're doing your first native seeding program as a proponent, as a consultant, whatever, and you have less than a month to procure and execute the seeding, you're really very doubtfully setting yourself up for success. You need to think in grams, not in kilograms, and you need to give yourself the tools and be smart with how you're using the grams of seed that you have in order to make it work for you to get the results you need on site. You need to account for the seasonal availability of the seed when you're trying to procure it, especially in large quantities. Seed size is important, and you need to take it into effect when you're planning your seed mixes and procuring your seeds so that you don't end up just making a field of grass when you are trying to have a really diverse ecosystem. And include diverse species, even if you can only get them in small amounts. It's better to have them in than not. And as someone who was giving a similar talk that I heard a couple weeks ago out of the US said, a diverse seed mix will lead to a diverse ecosystem more often than not. But chances are, if you don't put a diverse mix down, your site's not going to gain a lot of species diversity magically. When seeding, consider the rhizosphere. If you think you have a relatively poor topsoil, there are ways that you can go about enhancing the microbial life in your soil, even if it's just taking a bunch of woody debris and other material and mixing it in there. It's still going to give it a lot better than if you just end up with a flat track packed field of silty AE soil. And in an ideal world, give yourself 2 growing seasons before you go out and really judge your site. And you can do additional interventions if you want in that time, but just keep in mind that if you're a year out from when you seeded, you're still not seeing the full effect of that seeding on the landscape at that point. All right, and with that, I think we will leave ourselves for questions. So I'm just going to skip over a couple slides here, and we can go from there, May.
All right. That was amazing. Oh, yes, thank you for putting your contact info back up.
Yes.
The Q&A, we've got about 10 minutes or so. For questions, you can post via text in the Q&A section or the chat if you wish. I will moderate both. I will also turn on microphones if you'd like to live ask your question. If you choose the anonymous option for Q&As, I would just ask that you not let anonymity get in the way of civility. As with all our community of practice initiatives, we value respect for differences in our efforts to share information. So your first question is from Catherine Barrick. How are the seed capsules prepared or assembled? Is there a cost per number of capsules for the preparation?
Yeah, so when we prepare those, we do typically price them by the capsule on a bit of a sliding scale, depending on the amount that are being prepared for your project. We used to use a very traditional little hand press that you'd put all the capsules into by hand, fill them up, press them closed. We've recently invested in a machine that's would be used for filling a lot of the, supplements that you might find in a healthcare store and stuff like that, that we're able to do a lot of those a lot faster. So yeah, if you are based in the Northeast or ever find yourself up there, we are always more than happy to give a tour of kind of our facility and how they're made. But yeah, essentially we mix up the seed mix, we add in the other additives that are going in there, and then we can put that into a small hopper in small batches, put together, 5 to 10,000 of them at a time, pop that out, reload, and keep going from there. And so, yeah, it's turned into a process that is quite scalable for us at this point. And we're willing to do that with, seed that people provide, or if you really need help procuring the seed to begin with, we can help with that too in a lot of cases. But you don't have to work with us in any capacity if you're just looking for capsules to get made up. We're happy to do that as a service for folks as well.
Thank you. And then Christy Hunter's wondering what your seed capsules are made of and how long it takes for them to biodegrade. I'll add on there, are you sourcing them locally?
We get them from I believe they're like a health foods provider out of the Vancouver area right now. We get them sometimes locally in Fort St. John, but they just buy them from the same uh, manufacturer out of Vancouver that we can get them from. So oftentimes we'll go right from the source. As far as I'm aware, they are made of like a cellulose material, and so they're plant-based. They seem to degrade with water in about like a 5 day to 1 week sort of time frame, depending on exactly how much water is in the environment there. But once they get wet, they tend to start degrading quite rapidly. And yeah, we've been using them for about 5 years here now, and yeah, we've had really good success in kind of in our early case studies, seeing the little islands where they've popped up, and then into our more recent ones using Plantair and the drones, just seeing the propagation of a lot of the species that we were planting over the site.
Cool. Uh, Over on the chat, we have Mujan Samnani who's asked if we can get the slides emailed to us after this call.
I'm happy to provide May with the presentation if you want to commit to doing that or not. That's up to you.
Yeah, I can definitely share around a PDF.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the recording will be on CERN-BC's YouTube channel for future reviewings and screenshotting that one slide you invited us to screenshot.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, and if you aren't comfortable asking a question or you want more information from an answer I provided, anything, please feel free to reach out anytime. As long as you're not, asking something that's going to take up 10 hours of my time, I am more than happy to chat with folks and get answers out there and talk more about all this stuff as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jacob Williams is asking, do you have a favorite seed mix when applying it to a site that is already occupied with some nasty invasives, specifically Canada thistle?
Canada thistle, that is a fun one. I mean, I would say a couple of my favorite species right now are things like your yarrows, your pea vines, fireweed. I love including in the mixes just because it is so readily available generally from different places, as well as things like the paintbrush that we talked about earlier, strawberry whenever it's available, and just some of the like goldenrods, violets, stuff like that, just because we've seen really, really good success in a lot of those species actually showing up. And if you are trying to choke out a thistle infestation, you really want some successful species that are going to grow out really well. I mean, anyone who's had thistle anywhere will tell you it is a really, really tough one to deal with. If you have the option of dealing with it, if you're doing some earthworks on your site by trying to, bury some of the infected soils and stuff like that and other things that you can do mechanically, thistle is one of those things definitely that, takes a village and a whole toolkit to try to handle it without herbicides and stuff like that. And yeah, whatever you can throw at it, the more the merrier on that one for sure.
Hope competing with thistle. We've got another question from Catherine Baird asking, how does drone deployment of seeds or capsules work on a site? Like, is the drone on a pre-programmed route and the operator reloads the drone? And then the second part to the question, what is the unit? What's the type of unit that holds the seeds or capsules under the drone?
Sounds good. So Plantair, who we've been working with on the distribution of those, and if anyone wants Graham's contact information, I am happy to provide it as well if you get in touch with me. They have been running T100, or I believe it's a T100 DJI drone, the smallest of kind of the agricultural drones from DJI with a hopper on the top. He has also been playing around with getting a larger drone unit from them as well too, which can hold more seeds at a time and do slightly more area without having to come and land again. But yeah, essentially it has a hopper on the top, and we've worked with him to calibrate the rate that the capsules come out of the hopper in order to get the distribution on the ground that we like. And he will plan in a pre-fixed flight route based on the limitations of the area that is looking to be seeded, set that out and fly it. And then with that, like the height at which the drone flies can really depend a lot on the specific site and how close he can get to it and stuff like that. I believe he's flown it, kind of like up to 50 or up to like 20, 25, 30 meters above ground surface, like just above the tree line, and had some success with that. Whereas a lot of other work that I've heard of with UAV seeding right now, if you're using just native naked seed and stuff like that in there, usually the folks that I've heard who are doing that in the States and in Eastern Canada, they try to fly pretty low within like the first couple meters of the ground surface in order to try to make it so the seed doesn't all fly away as it's coming out of the hopper and getting distributed on the site. So yeah, he's been able with the capsules because of the weight of them to get up somewhat high depending on the site as well too. And yeah, it's seemed to work out really well in that way. He can get like a hectare of area seeded in like under 10 minutes sometimes and stuff like that, from drone takeoff to landing again and everything. It's pretty crazy.
Peter's gonna take our jobs. That's all the questions that I see. So I will ask maybe one final question. You
sure.
talked about encapsulation and then some Alberta folks that are doing pelletization. Is there anybody doing more low-tech solutions like the seed pucks or seed balls that you used to hear about more?
I've heard some folks about the seed pucks and stuff like that. I believe there's a company out in Northeast BC anyways, that is looking at the seed pucks. The thing I find with the seed pucks most often is they're usually, the companies that are doing them are really focused on tree species with the seed pucks, since they're intended a lot more for forestry. I have not run across anyone who's tried dabbling with a lot of forb species in them right now, but theoretically, there's no reason that I can think of why a Ford wouldn't work in something like that on a theoretical basis. So that's certainly an option that could be looked into for some of those as well too. There's been a lot of experimentation on ways to package up native seed over the last 4 years even to make it easier to apply to put out onto the field. So it's been one of the really cool things and how much of that is coming up. And as someone who has been doing a little bit of it, it's been great to see industries start to look into actually integrating it into their processes and be willing to experiment a little bit with it, because that's the sort of thing that we need if anyone's going to be able to do this sort of stuff as a viable ongoing business.
Yeah, looking at you, industrial folks on the call. Thank you again for your time today, Aaron, and for being willing to share some of your learnings with the community of practice. As promised, I will send around Aaron's slides once I have those in hand. So I will see you all in your inboxes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. It's been great.